What do you make of what's going on right now in the U.S. banking situation? Because your banking system is integrated with ours. Are you worried about our banks?
Well, I think any disruption in banking is something to be alert to. Canada has extraordinarily solid banking systems, as we saw through the challenges you all faced in 2008 that we didn't face. We're watching carefully. We're there to be helpful if we need to, but so far things seem to be underhand.
Are you worried about contagion at all? Things that are happening here making it up north of the border?
I think that's a concern that people will automatically have. We need to keep watching closely, but I'm not overly concerned.
And what about the economy, the situation of the economy? We're getting economic numbers out here, also up in Canada. Obviously, we've had an inflation problem. The central banks are trying to get that under control. We're seeing some slowing, I think maybe in both economies. What do your experts tell you about the U.S. economy? Are we going into recession? Is it going to drag you into one?
I think we're all aware that there are choppy waters coming for the global economy, potential slowdown. The question is more about how long it'll last, how deep it'll be, and where it'll hit hardest. In Canada, we're seeing inflation come down fairly aggressively. We should be down around 3% or even lower by the summer, so that'll take a lot of the pressure off. In terms of slowdowns, the biggest challenge around slowdowns is always job losses. And we're just seeing such strong job numbers right now in Canada and indeed in the United States that the slowdown might happen, but the job losses may or may not be that significant. And one way or another, in Canada, we're going to be ready with supports if it happens.
We've seen two of your priorities come together recently with respect to the Volkswagen plant, the battery plant up in Ontario. Two priorities. One is climate. You set out as a goal for Canada to be a climate leader and for you to be a climate leader. At the same time, you want to attract investment into Canada. You see them come together. Give us your sense about that investment, because there was a substantial subsidy involved. Is that something you wanted to do, or is it something you had to do given what the United States was doing with the Inflation Reduction Act?
It's funny, David, because when you said my two priorities, I thought you were going to go with the critical minerals that Canada has that the world needs in the production of batteries and the great workforce we have in Canada, which are the two priorities that we've been focused on. The resources in the ground and the resources above the ground are really Canada's value proposition for companies coming in. Yes, the IRA is something that we've had to step up to make sure we're competitive, but we're going to be a lot more strategic about how we pick and choose the right investments. We can't just do it blanket like the US can. And therefore, picking and working with the Volkswagen plant, which is really looking at creating batteries, 1 million batteries a year for the next decades, and implanting that in a strong community where the opportunities are there for growth, the opportunities are there to source nearby critical minerals with green electricity. Like, these are all things that they were looking for, and quite frankly, companies and countries like Germany and Japan and South Korea are very, very interested in Canadian critical minerals, Canadian quality manufacturing, and I'm glad to be down here working to draw in some American investment as well.
Climate is a big priority for you,
yes.
And going forward, do you see individual circumstances like the VW plant you'd step up to? Would you have an overall policy? Do you endorse the notion of subsidies to try to expedite the green transition?
Well, I think the advantage that Canada has is we've been really working extremely hard on creating that framework for green investment for 8 years now. And everyone's saying, oh, how are you going to respond to the IRA? My response is the IRA is a little bit of a response to what Canada's been doing and that the US fell behind on for 4 years under the previous administration, not looking at the incredible opportunities that come with climate leadership. So we're going to continue doing this. We put a price on pollution years ago that is continuing to increase, and it works because we return more money into the pockets of the average families, even as we put a price on carbon emissions. And that's something that both pushes industry in the right direction and makes Canadians feel like they're part of fighting climate change and growing the economy.
As you say, I think in your first term you put a carbon tax or a price on carbon in Canada.
And then won 2 elections on it.
And won 2 elections. Congratulations. You've had various policies. In fact, Canada for some years has had various policies. Clearly, you're committed to it. Clearly, you have the strategy. Do you have the results? Because if you actually look at the results in terms of emissions, I'm not sure they're showing up yet.
Actually, as of about a couple of weeks ago, the latest report shows that we are actually bending the curve, that we are on our way down, not just in absolute emissions, but in emissions intensity as well, even as our economy grows significantly. In Canada, for very real reasons, before we took office, Canada was seen as a laggard on fighting climate change, partially because we have a significant and important oil and gas sector. But what we've been able to do is demonstrate that the energy sector in Canada writ large, including oil and gas, is going to do well as we decarbonize, as we invest in things like CCUS, as we make the change towards hydrogen. There are tremendous opportunities to be ahead of the curve in where the global economy is going, and Canadian leadership is going to be a big part of that solution.
You referred to some of the minerals you have in abundance up in Canada. As I say, you really want to encourage, obviously, foreign direct investment. We have those two coming together right now in the Glencore proposal with respect to Teck. A lot of controversy that I've read about, including your opposition leader now is saying, boy, it's a terrible mistake to have Glencore, a Swiss company, buy this Canadian company. How do you analyze that problem? I mean, you want foreign direct investment, but are you giving up something in terms of control or indeed in terms of jobs?
Well, first of all, Teck is a great company with its headquarters in Vancouver, thousands of jobs in Canada, and it's certainly something that we're looking very, very carefully at, because it is important to have these great companies in Canada and that are trying to do the right things the right ways. But that's why we have a rigorous process that's going through that our industry minister is looking at carefully, and we'll follow along and make sure that we are consistent in the way we apply the process and the rules so investors can know what they're getting into. We need to be predictable, and that's what Canada's working to do.
Is it important for your climate approach who controls a company like Teck? Because as a practical matter, what happens in the green transition will depend on somebody who produces coal, who produces some of the things that Teck's involved in. Is it more important that it be a Canadian company than a Swiss company?
What's more important to me is the company behaving the right way towards the environment, whether it's a local company or a foreign multinational. We have high and stringent expectations, not just on environmental issues, but on partnership with Indigenous peoples that has actually been building trust, that is getting projects built faster in Canada now. And we also care deeply about the quality of labor, the pay that's being paid, the support for workers. That's where the investments we've made in things like $10 a day childcare, in dental care and public health care are actually part of the competitive advantage that absenteeism in Canadian factories is way lower than in American factories. There is a quality of support for the middle class in Canada that we're building on that is all part of where we find it's actually advantageous for global companies to come invest.
Talk about foreign investment for a different direction, China. There are new restrictions, as I understand it, on state-owned enterprises from China investing in some of the mineral resources of Canada. Some people in that area in Canada say, wait a second, by curtailing that investment, you may be curtailing the production of some key elements to make the green transition. How do you strike that balance?
We have seen over the years China not hesitating to use its trade leverage for geopolitical gains. And that is something that we have to be very, very mindful about. And the pandemic taught us that resilience and reliance on friends and places that share our values for essential inputs to the economy we're building is really important. What we've seen around semiconductors, what we're seeing around the fact that all of our lithium in the world pretty much comes through China now, doesn't have to be that way, and that's why we're building that resilience, not just for ourselves, but for American friends, for European friends, for people who are willing to buy our lithium and not want to be entirely wrapped up on parts of the world that are less reliable, as Europe understood when Russia turned off the taps for oil and gas.
We've watched the Biden administration administration work its way through an approach to China that both really protects national interests, including national security interests, but at the same time does have some economic relationship with them. What is the Canadian approach to that? Are there things actually that the United States could learn from that?
Well, one of the things that we have to be around China is extremely clear-eyed. There are areas where we can and should be engaging and working together. And a good example of that was Canada just hosted the Nature COP, COP15 in December in Montreal, alongside China, where we came out with some very ambitious targets for protecting biodiversity around the world, 30% by 2030. These are good things that you can do together. But there's other areas where we're going to have to absolutely compete and even challenge China on the economic spheres. And there are other places where we're going to have to actively contest China on human rights, on labor standards, on how they're engaging with different places around the world. We need to be thoughtful and solid and predictable, but very firm on our values.
Are you and your administration in Ottawa coordinating closely with Washington, the United States, on exactly those sorts of approaches? Because they're very difficult issues.
Actually, I'd say we're not even just coordinating the two of us, we're coordinating at the G7 level. In a couple of weeks, the G7 leaders will all be gathering in Japan at Hiroshima to talk about how we deal with what Russia has offered as chaos to the world, the challenge that China represents even as we continue to engage, and doing that in a thoughtful, strategic way that actually recognizes our capacity to bolster democracy at a time where perhaps it's fraying around the edges by working together, by aligning ourselves in the things that matter most to all of our citizens and people around the world.
Give us your thoughts also on the Canadian approach to immigration. I know President Biden was just recently up visiting you, and there was a new agreement reached that sort of took care of some of the issues about immigration, how we handle it. It's a difficult problem, at least for us in the United States. What is the Canadian approach? How is it different from the United States? And again, could we learn from what you're doing up there?
Well, Canada has long had a very strong immigration system that Canadians have had confidence in because we were able to control people coming to our country, and that meant we were able to do more on immigration and more immigration without seeing political backlash. Canadians know that welcoming people into our communities contributes to the wealth of that communities, creates opportunities and jobs. That's how our economy continues to grow so well, and that's what we're going to continue to do. But it does require us to be able to reassure Canadians that we do have control of that process, and that's where the new agreement with President Biden on renewing and adjusting our Safe Third Country agreement was important.
And finally, Mr. Prime Minister, you just gave a speech at the Council for Foreign Relations I was pleased to read, and it sets out sort of a newish approach to really dealing with international economic matters, in which says free trade is fine, but it can go too far. But that basically we didn't have the values reflected that otherwise we would.
It's not quite that. It's that we know that trade creates growth. That is a great thing. But if the benefits of that growth don't accrue to citizens, they will start pulling their support away from pro-growth policies like trade. And that's where within the trade deals, I mean, Canada over the past years has become the only G7 country with a free trade deal with every other G7 country. And we did that at a time where lots of countries are turning inwards and a little more protectionist. We did that on the one hand by making sure that there are labor standards, women protection, equality of women protections, indigenous standards, environmental standards in the trade deals we signed, so people are supportive of those. But also to make sure that we are investing in the middle class and people working hard to join it with things like childcare and dental care and health care that make sure that people know that as the country grows, as the economy grows, they're going to be carried forward into a positive future that has room for them.
And yet, at a time when we're all facing inflation, one of the benefits of free trade without some of the encumbrances was lower prices. Can you achieve the goals you're describing, which are laudatory goals, without people paying a higher price, without the standard of living coming down somewhat? And is that price worth paying?
I think there's a question we have to ask ourselves as we pat ourselves on the back for our system of free market democracies. Is it really the best system when the system relies on the exploitation of people or of environment and on low labor standards in authoritarian states around the world. We cannot pretend that we have the best system if we're protecting our rivers and streams here and trying to support our middle class here, but allowing people to live in poverty on the other side of the world. The pandemic and recent events have shown that the world is too small for that. We have to be a little more rigorous and have a little more integrity in how we look at our systems, and I think people are ready for that.